The valley floor shimmered under a relentless sun, a cauldron of heat where the town of Redemption Gulch clung to the dusty earth like a patch of stubborn lichen. Its buildings were fashioned from sun-bleached timber and wishful thinking, their foundations shallow, their faith placed in a sky that was usually stingy with its tears. From the parched main street, if you tilted your head just so and squinted against the glare, you could trace the immense, craggy profile of the mountain that shadowed the valley. The townsfolk called it Old Man Stone, a silent, impassive giant whose moods were written in cloud and wind. And high on its granite cheek, a dark slash against the gray, was the mouth of a cave. This was the place that drew their scorn, their pity, and their fearful curiosity, for this was the home of Silas. He was the gunslinger who had arrived with a past tucked behind his quiet eyes and a weary German shepherd at his heels, a man who had traded his holster for a hammer and built a life not among them, but above them, inside the very rock they feared. They saw a man hiding from the world. They never once considered he might be preparing for it. Silas moved with a deliberate economy of motion. His life a quiet rhythm played out against the vast, patient silence of the mountain. Mornings were for checking the small, high-altitude garden he'd coaxed from a patch of earth near the cave mouth, its soil carried up bucket by painstaking bucket. Afternoons were for reinforcing the dry stone walls that channeled the trickles of snowmelt, or for sitting on his crude wooden porch, a mug of chicory coffee steaming in his hands as he watched the world below. His dog, Shadow, a creature of midnight fur and amber eyes, was his only constant companion. He would lay his great head on Silas's knee, a warm, living anchor in the solitude. Silas would murmur to him, his voice a low rumble that was part of the mountain's own song. "See that boy? Bartholomew's getting another shipment of linens. Man's more worried about tablecloths than he is about his roof." Shadow would offer a soft thump of his tail against the floorboards, a perfect and uncomplicated agreement. The people of Redemption Gulch saw a broken man living in a glorified hole. They whispered about him over cracker barrels and mending, weaving tales of madness and cowardice. What they couldn't see was the profound peace in the man's gaze, or the way his hands, when they rested on the cool, living stone of his home, seemed to be listening to a conversation they would never hear. The sun glinting off the window of the general store was what did it. A sharp, painful flash of light that shot through the years and found a younger Silas, a man who still believed foundations were best laid in soft earth, among other people. He wasn't in the high, dry quiet of the mountain then. He was down in a river valley much like this one, in a town called Havens Ford. The memory came not as a gentle stream but as a flash flood, violent and unbidden. He had a wife then, Alara, whose laughter was like the sound of the river in springtime, and a small son, Toby, who was just learning to chase the chickens in their yard. Their house was a proper one, built of fresh-cut pine, filled with the scent of baking bread and the clutter of a life lived fully and without fear. The rain that came was a blessing at first, a dark curtain that swept away the summer dust. But it didn't stop. For 3 days and 3 nights, it fell with a biblical fury, a relentless drumming that slowly morphed from a comfort into a threat. The river, their gentle neighbor, began to writhe and swell, its voice deepening from a murmur to a guttural roar. Silas remembered the panic, the frantic scramble to move things to the second floor, the nervous laughter that died in their throats as the brown water began to seep through the floorboards. He'd told Alara it would be fine. He'd held Toby and promised him it was a grand adventure. But the water rose faster than hope. It was a liquid beast, a formless, merciless antagonist that consumed everything. The last thing he saw was Alara's face, framed in the attic window as the current ripped their home from its foundations, her hand pressed against the glass. He had been on the roof of the barn, trying to free their horses, and was swept away himself, clinging to a piece of wreckage until he was spat out on a muddy bank miles downstream, the lone survivor of a family, of a life. That memory was why he chose stone. Wood splintered, earth washed away. The bonds of community, as strong as they seemed, were no match for a force that didn't care about names or faces. Only the mountain endured. Old Man Stone had watched countless floods claw at its feet and had never flinched. Living within its embrace was not an act of hiding. It was an act of remembrance, a solemn vow made to the ghosts of Haven's Ford that he would never again put his faith in anything that could be washed away. He chose stone because it was the only thing that had ever truly kept its promises. His cabin inside the cave was a testament to that vow, its timbers securely bolted into the unyielding granite, its hearth built from rocks that had known a million storms. Silas guided his mule, Patience, down the winding path toward Redemption Gulch, Shadow trotting silently beside them. The trip to town was a necessary evil, a brief foray into a world of noise and judgment he'd gladly forsaken. As he tethered Patience outside Bartholomew's general store, he could feel the town's gaze settle on him like a physical weight. Whispers followed him like his own shadow, rising and falling in the spaces between the clatter of wagon wheels and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. He was an anomaly, a story they told their children to encourage conformity. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The store smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. Bartholomew, a man whose frame was as wide as his opinions were narrow, stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a grubby rag. He looked up, his expression a well-practiced sneer. "Well, look what the mountain coughed up," he announced to the two ranchers lingering by the flour barrels. "Come down for some civilized goods. Have you, Silas? Or just tired of talking to your dog?" Silas ignored the jibe, his eyes scanning the shelves. He needed salt, coffee, and a new whetstone. He moved through the store with the quiet purpose that defined all his actions. "A man belongs with other men," Bartholomew continued, his voice rising, "in a proper house with a roof and four walls on God's green earth, not burrowed into a rock like a gopher. It's unnatural," one of the ranchers chuckled nervously. Mayor Thompson entered then, a tall, perpetually worried man who carried the town's anxieties in the slump of his shoulders. He nodded curtly at Silas. "Silas, all's well up there." There was a flicker of genuine, if wary, concern in his eyes. "All's well," Silas replied, his voice raspy from disuse. It was often the first time he'd spoken to another human in weeks. He placed his goods on the counter. Salt, coffee, whetstone. He didn't make eye contact with Bartholomew, instead choosing to look at the man's hands as he tallied the cost. He could feel the mayor's hesitation, the silent debate about whether to extend a hand of friendship or maintain a safe distance. The distance always won. As Bartholomew bagged his things, Silas reached into his coat and gave Shadow a small piece of jerky he'd saved for him. The dog took it gently, his amber eyes fixed on his master's face with an unwavering loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the shifting, uncertain glances of the townsfolk. "You spoil that beast," Bartholomew grumbled, sliding the bag across the counter. Silas placed the coins on the wood. "He's better company than most," he said, the words quiet but clear. The store fell silent for a moment. He picked up his bag, gave a slight nod that encompassed no one and everyone, and walked out, the cheerful bell marking his exit. Back in the sunlight, he felt the tension in his shoulders ease. The judgment of the town was a fleeting thing, a puff of dust in the wind. The mountain, his silent, solid partner, was waiting. It didn't judge, simply was. A change was coming. It wasn't in the town's gossip or the price of flour, but in the air itself. For a week, the sky had been a pale, hazy blue, the sun a white-hot coin in a sea of bleached silk. But now, a deeper, bruised purple was gathering on the western horizon, and the wind, which usually carried the scent of dust and distant pine, now held a damp, earthy smell, the smell of a saturated world. Silas felt it on his skin and in his bones. Old Man Stone felt it too. The mountain, his silent confidant, had begun to speak in a language of subtle signs. The high country springs, usually a reliable trickle, were weeping more freely. The picas, the small, busy rock rabbits of the upper slopes, had fallen strangely silent, their usual chirps and whistles absent from the air. Even the lichen on the northern faces of the boulders seemed to have darkened, drinking in a humidity that was not yet visible. Silas stood on his porch, watching the clouds muster their forces. Shadow whined softly at his side, pressing against his leg, his animal senses confirming what Silas already knew. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, his hand resting on the dog's head. The old man's just clearing his throat inside the cave. His work took on a new urgency, though his movements remained calm and measured. He wasn't panicking, he was responding. He spent a day clearing the small, carefully constructed drainage channels that lined the entrance to his dwelling, ensuring that any water flowing down the mountain face would be guided away from his home and over the edge of the cliff below. He checked the seals on his food barrels, restocked his supply of dry firewood from a deep, sheltered recess in the cave, and filled every container he had with fresh water from his personal spring, which seeped directly from a fissure in the rock. The people in the valley below saw the same clouds, but they read a different story. To them, the promise of rain was a long-awaited blessing, a reprieve from a dry season that had threatened their crops and withered their pastures. They saw relief, not a threat. They were deaf to the mountain's low grumble, blind to the signs that Silas read as clearly as a printed page. He worked with a quiet intensity, a man in dialogue with his environment. The stone walls around him felt different, humming with a low-frequency vibration as the atmospheric pressure dropped. He was listening to a language the world had forgotten, the ancient tongue of rock and water. Before we see what the mountain was trying to tell him, take a moment to subscribe, so you won't miss how this gunslinger's strange home becomes an ark for the very people who scorned him. Silas's preparation was a ritual of respect. He was a tenant in this great stone edifice, and he knew better than to ignore his landlord's warnings. As dusk fell, painting the undersides of the ominous clouds in shades of orange and violet, he sat with Shadow and watched the first flicker of distant lightning. There was no thunder yet, just silent, ghostly flashes that illuminated the towering cloud bank, revealing its immense, churning depth. Redemption Gulch was a string of cheerful yellow lights below, a fragile constellation of human ignorance nestled in the palm of a gathering storm. Silas felt a familiar pang of melancholy, not for himself, but for them. They had built their lives on the floor of a tub, and had forgotten that someone, somewhere, still held the faucet. The first drop of rain was not a gentle pitter-patter. It was a heavy splat against the stone porch, as fat and loud as a thrown pebble. Another followed, then a dozen more, and within moments, the world outside Silas's cave was obscured by a shimmering, deafening curtain of water. It was not the thirst-quenching shower the valley had prayed for. This was a different kind of rain, an invasive rain, falling with a weight and a fury that spoke of annihilation, not nourishment. The sound was immense, a constant, percussive roar that filled the air and vibrated through the rock, a sound so total it seemed to swallow all other noises. From his perch, Silas watched the storm assault the valley. The lights of Redemption Gulch began to blur and bleed into the wet darkness. He imagined the townsfolk, at first celebrating, holding their hands out to the sky with grateful smiles. He could picture Bartholomew proclaiming it a miracle, a reward for their piety. But soon, the joy would curdle into concern, and concern into fear, as the dusty streets turned to muddy rivers and the cheerful drumming on their tin roofs became the sound of a relentless siege. Inside his cave, the world was calm. The fire in his hearth crackled softly, its warm light dancing on the smooth, rock walls and the sturdy wooden beams of his cabin within a cave. Shadow lay before the fire, not with the tense anxiety he displayed during a normal thunderstorm, but with a deep, settled calm, as if he understood that the chaos of the world could not breach these walls. Silas moved to a small, protected overlook he had fashioned at the side of the cave's mouth, a natural window shielded by a massive granite overhang. He looked down at the Silver Serpent, the modest creek that gave the valley its only water source. It was no longer silver. It was a churning, brown beast, visibly swelling with every passing minute, its banks dissolving as it gorged itself on the runoff from the surrounding slopes. The rain was not just falling, it was being funneled. The very shape of the valley, which made it a sanctuary in the dry times, was now its fatal flaw. All the water falling for miles around was being directed to this one low-lying point. The mountain was shedding the deluge, shrugging it off its stone shoulders and sending it straight towards the fragile homes below. He could hear a new sound now, beneath the roar of the rain, the deep, grinding groan of moving earth and the splintering crack of trees losing their purchase. The impersonal antagonist had arrived, and it was not in a mood for mercy. The rising tension he felt was not for his own safety, but for the safety of the fools below, the ones who had mocked his fortress of stone, secure in their flimsy homes of wood and pride. The water was rising, and Silas knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this was only the beginning. The roar intensified. It was the sound of a world coming undone. A deep, gut-wrenching tremor ran through the mountain, a vibration of colossal forces colliding below. From his vantage point, Silas saw the moment the silver serpent broke its leash. It was no longer a creek. It was a liquid battering ram, a surging wall of brown water, debris, and fury that slammed into the edge of Redemption Gulch. The blacksmith's shop, the first building in its path, vanished not in a splintering crash but in a silent, horrifying gulp, consumed whole by the torrent. Then the livery, then the assayer's office. The town was being erased building by building. Silas's heart, a muscle he had long trained into a state of quiet dormancy, began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He saw them then, small figures scrambling in the chaos, their lamplight swinging wildly in the deluge. They were heading for the church, the tallest building in town, its steeple a beacon of false hope. They thought high ground was a second floor. They didn't understand the water wasn't just rising around them. It was coming for the very earth beneath their feet. A profound and terrible choice presented itself. He could stay here, in the calm, dry safety of his stone sanctuary, a silent witness to the end of a town that had offered him nothing but scorn. Or he could go down there, into the teeth of the very beast that had stolen his first life, and try to offer them the one thing he had in abundance: a way out. Shadow, sensing the turmoil in him, pushed his head hard against Silas's hand, a low whine escaping his throat. Silas looked down into those intelligent amber eyes, and the choice was made. He could not be the man who watched. He had already been that man once, helpless on a barn roof. Not again. "Stay here, boy," he commanded, his voice tight. "Guard the home." The dog whined again, a sound of protest, but sat, obedient. Silas turned from the warmth of his fire and strode into the storm. He grabbed a coil of heavy rope, a woodsman's axe, and a waterproof oilskin pouch containing flint and steel. The path down the mountain was no longer a path. It was a treacherous, cascading waterfall. The rain was so dense it was like moving through water, each step a gamble against the slick, shifting rock. The wind tore at him, trying to peel him from the mountainside. But Silas moved with a certainty born of long acquaintance with this terrain. He knew every handhold, every foothold, every treacherous patch of scree. He was not a townsman fighting a flood. He was a piece of the mountain, as resolute and unyielding as the granite beneath his feet, moving to correct an imbalance. The lights of the church below were his destination, a flickering candle of humanity in a world drowning in darkness. The edge of the floodwater was a maelstrom of churning mud and debris. Entire trees, ripped from the earth, tumbled end over end in the current. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening cacophony of roaring water and the shrieking groan of dying buildings. Silas reached what used to be the beginning of Main Street and stopped. Before him was a raging river where a town had once stood. The church was an island in the torrent, the water already halfway up its stained glass windows. Figures were visible on the roof, huddled around the base of the steeple, their faces pale and terrified in the intermittent flashes of lightning. He saw Mayor Thompson, his arm around his wife, trying to project an aura of calm that his shaking form betrayed. He saw Bartholomew, the storekeeper, clinging to the shingles, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, the man's earlier arrogance washed away by the flood. Getting to them was impossible. The current was too strong, the water too full of deadly, unseen obstacles. A direct approach was suicide. But Silas wasn't thinking directly. He was thinking like the mountain. He scanned the scene, his gaze moving past the immediate chaos to the larger topography. A line of sturdy oak trees, old and deep-rooted, stood on the higher ground behind the church, their branches overhanging a section of the roof. Between his position and those trees was a 50-foot gap of murderous water. He uncoiled his rope. He tied one end securely around the base of a massive boulder, a stone anchor that had not moved in 1,000 years. He fashioned a loop in the other end. He then did something that would become a legend in the valley. He drew the old revolver from the holster he rarely wore, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He took a steadying breath, the rain plastering his hair to his face. In one fluid motion, he looped the rope over his arm, took him not at a man but at a thick branch on the far side, and fired. The shot was swallowed by the storm, but the rope, propelled by the weight of its own coil and the gunslinger's impossible aim, snaked out across the water, fell short. He reeled it in, his movements economical, his face a mask of concentration. He fired again. This time, the loop snagged, caught, and held fast on a thick fork in the oak branch. He pulled it taut, the rope groaning under the strain, a lifeline stretched across chaos. "The rope!" he bellowed, his voice raw but carrying over the din. "To the trees! Climb across!" Heads turned. Eyes squinted through the rain. They saw him, a lone, drenched figure, a ghost from the mountain. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then the instinct for survival took over. The mayor was the first to move, securing his wife before inching his way toward the rope. One by one, they began to cross, a desperate, hand-over-hand journey from their sinking island of faith to the solid ground Silas had secured for them. The climb up the mountain was a brutal pilgrimage. The survivors, numb with cold, shock, and grief, followed the silent man and his dog up a path that seemed to lead to the very heart of the storm. Each step was an agony of mud-slicked rock and burning lungs. They were a flock of sodden, broken sheep, and Silas was their grim, unsmiling shepherd. They did not speak. The only sounds were the lashing rain, their own ragged breaths, and the occasional sob that was quickly swallowed by the wind. When they finally reached the wide ledge and saw the mouth of the cave, a dark maw in the mountainside, they hesitated. This was the place of the madman, the unnatural home they had whispered about. But then they saw the light from within, a steady, golden glow that promised warmth and safety. They smelled the wood smoke and the faint, comforting aroma of brewing coffee. It was a promise of life. As they stumbled across the threshold, the transition was so abrupt it was disorienting. Outside was a world of violent, roaring chaos. Inside was a profound and enveloping silence, broken only by the gentle crackling of a large, well-tended fire. The air was warm and dry. The walls were not the damp, dripping rock of a simple cave, but a fusion of smooth stone and expertly fitted timbers, creating a dwelling that felt both ancient and utterly solid. Shadow met them at the entrance, not with aggression, but with a calm, curious dignity, nudging a small, weeping child with his nose. Silas moved past them without a word and began pulling thick wool blankets from a large wooden chest. He didn't offer comfort or condolences. He offered practicality. "Get out of the wet clothes," he said, his voice a flat command. "There are blankets. Coffee's on." He gestured toward the hearth where a massive iron pot hung over the flames. The townsfolk stood dripping on the stone floor, looking around in stunned disbelief. This was no hermit's hovel. This was a fortress, a sanctuary. It was meticulously organized, with shelves carved into the rock holding neatly stacked supplies, a clean-swept floor, and a simple but sturdy table and chairs. It was a home built with foresight, patience, and a deep understanding of the world. Bartholomew, shivering uncontrollably, his face streaked with mud and tears, finally found his voice. "Silas, we," he stammered, unable to form the words of apology and gratitude that were choking him. Silas turned from the fire, a tin mug of coffee in his hand. He looked at the man who had been his most vocal critic, his face unreadable. He simply pushed the mug into Bartholomew's shaking hands. "Drink," he said. The simple, non-judgmental act of charity was more powerful than any speech. It was in that moment that the people of Redemption Gulch began to understand. They hadn't been mocking a madman. They had been mocking a prophet. The rain finally ceased just before dawn. A strange, exhausted silence fell over the valley, broken by the drip of water from the cave's overhang and the mournful sound of the receding flood. The survivors, wrapped in Silas's blankets, had spent the night in a state of huddled shock, sleeping fitfully on the floor of his impossible home. As the first pale, gray light of morning filtered into the cave, they stirred. Led by Mayor Thompson, they moved to the entrance, a silent, grim procession drawn by a need to see what remained of their world. They gathered on the stone porch looking down. The sight was one of utter biblical devastation. Redemption Gulch was gone. The valley floor was a ruin of mud, splintered wood, and the unrecognizable detritus of their lives. A few skeletal frames of the sturdiest buildings remained, but the rest had been scoured from the earth, leaving behind a brown, scarred wasteland. The Silver Serpent had returned to its banks, but it was a stranger now, having carved a new, wider path through their reality. A collective gasp went through the small crowd, followed by a wave of quiet, soul-deep weeping. Everything was lost. Their homes, their businesses, their history. All of it buried under a thick blanket of mud. Silas stood apart from them, leaning against the rock wall with his mug of coffee, shadow at his side. He watched their grief, his expression unchanged, but a deep, resonant empathy flowed from his stillness. He knew this moment. He had lived it himself, standing on a muddy riverbank years ago. He let them grieve, offering them the dignity of his silence. After a long while, Mayor Thompson turned away from the ruin of his town and faced Silas. His face was haggard, aged a decade overnight, but his eyes were clear with a new, profound understanding. "We called you a coward," the mayor said, his voice hoarse but carrying in the quiet air for all to hear. "We said you were hiding from the world. We were the cowards, Silas. We were hiding from the truth." He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the solid, unbreachable home Silas had built. "You listened to the mountain. You understood. We only listened to ourselves." He gestured to the small, shivering group of survivors. "These people, this is all that's left of Redemption Gulch. And we are only alive because of you." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked from the mayor's earnest face to the devastated valley below. "The mountain let you borrow this valley," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It just came to collect the rent. It'll let you borrow it again. But next time you build with stone. You build on high ground. You listen." The words were simple, practical, devoid of ego or triumph. He wasn't claiming victory. He was teaching a lesson. In his quiet wisdom, he offered not just a postmortem, but a blueprint for a future. The survivors looked at him, then at each other. They had lost everything they owned, but in the shelter of the outcast's cave, they had found something they hadn't even realized was missing: a foundation. A year passed. The valley healed itself with the slow, persistent grace of nature. Green shoots pushed up through the drying mud, and the scar tissue of the flood slowly faded under a blanket of new grass and wildflowers. The town of Redemption Gulch was not rebuilt in the same place. Its memory was a permanent stain on the valley floor, a cautionary tale told in splintered foundations. Instead, a new settlement was rising, a little further up the slope, on a wide, sunlit bench of land that the floodwaters had never touched. It was called Stone Haven, and its name was a tribute. The buildings were different now. They rose not on flimsy timber posts, but on solid, painstakingly laid foundations of river rock and granite, dug deep into the earth. The people had learned the mountain's lesson, a lesson taught to them by the gunslinger they once scorned. Silas was no longer an outcast. He still lived in his cave, preferring the quiet company of the rock and his dog, but he was not alone. The path to his home was now well worn, not by the curious or the fearful, but by those seeking advice. He would sit on his porch and Mayor Thompson, now the leader of Stone Haven, would come to ask about the best place to sink a new well. Bartholomew, a quieter and more humble man who had reopened his general store in a sturdy stone building, would bring him a share of his finest coffee beans, and they would sit in comfortable silence, watching the condors ride the thermals. The children of the settlement, who had once been told to fear the crazy man on the mountain, now saw him as a figure of legend. They would sometimes make the climb to bring him a freshly baked loaf of bread or a jar of wild berry jam, and he would greet them with a rare, small smile, and Shadow would accept their pats with a gently thumping tail. He taught them how to read the clouds, how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to understand the quiet language of the land. He never raised his voice, never sought a position of power, yet he had become the unshakable moral and practical center of their new world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, Silas stood on his porch, looking down at the twinkling lights of Stone Haven. The sounds of a hammer on wood and the distant laughter of a child drifted up to him on the cool evening air. It was the sound of a community not just surviving, but thriving, reborn from disaster, stronger and wiser than before. Shadow rested his head on Silas's knee. Silas placed a hand on the dog's warm fur, his gaze content. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude, a refuge from a world that had taken everything from him. He had built his home in stone to keep the world out, but in the end, by opening his door, he had found his way back into it, not as a gunslinger or an outcast, but as a neighbor. And he understood, finally, that the strongest foundations were not just stone, but the bonds of a community that had learned to listen to the mountain and to the quiet man who spoke its language. The story of Silas teaches us that true strength is often quiet, and wisdom is found not in loud opinions, but in patient observation. If his journey from outcast to hero moved you, consider supporting our channel to help us create more tales of resilience and unexpected wisdom. Thank you for watching.